some of the hardest times are coming as people assess roads that may have buckled and they have to be repaired, or families that cannot get back into their mobile home that's been destroyed, or communities that have lost resources that we don't even know about today. And we have to stay together, all of us working together, local, state, and federal, to make sure we're here for them in the long run.
Well, that's Senator Patty Murray just a few days ago up on the Skagit River, issuing warnings about what's ahead with the historic flooding going on throughout our region here in the month of December. The Army Corps of Engineers has actually had to take over the operation of a dam that provides power to the city of Seattle through City Light. Plus, an important vote this week from the council on the comprehensive plan regarding the future growth of the city, but it turns out this process is not done yet. Plus, how real are the plans for new revenue and new taxes for the city of Seattle in 2026? All this and more on Seattle News, Views, and Brews this week, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I am a host on the Seattle channel. The views expressed here are mine. I'm with my friend and co-host David Croman, City Hall reporter for the Seattle Times. If things sound a little bit different, that's because we're actually recording this podcast in City Hall, a little bouncy in here, just a few feet away from our background noise sponsor, City Grind Espresso. It's our Patrons Appreciation event. Quite possibly the event of the century, David. I think you would argue. Yeah, there they are, cheering in the background. There we go. All right, I love it. I love it. Steve is here. Claire is here. Very much appreciate that. Omari is here, too. Very glad to see all these patrons showing up. And, David, I got to ask, are these cookies I had made with the Seattle News, Views, and Brews logo, are they great, or are they the greatest cookie of all time?
Yeah, they're incredible. I didn't realize that you could just dial this one up and have them sent to you.
This is a thing. Yeah, the power of the internet has once again come through for us. So to our patrons, cookies today and some free coffees at City Grind. So thank you, John, once again from City Grind for hooking us up. That's very nice. Thank you, David, as always, for joining me here. And a huge thanks once again to all of our patrons. If you've shown up for the cookies, great. The free coffee, that's great. Great to meet up with everybody. And everyone else who supports the show, this is all about you, really supports you. And I wanted to say, if you're not a patron, if you want in on the fun, please support the show, starting at just $5 a month. With that, you'll get access to events like this, Patrons First podcast, got some of those coming up in the new year, and you'll even get your own Seattle News, Views, and Brews decal. How about that? So, if you want to be a patron, head to Patreon online, support Seattle News, Views, and Brews. Also, thank you for watching this podcast on Converge Media. The video version is on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let's do this. Time for Right Here, Right Now. David, you have been doing double duty over the past few weeks, covering your City Hall beat and keeping the news pumping on the historic flooding we're seeing throughout our region. You put together one piece that I thought was very interesting. Flooding on the Skagit River has actually cut off the town of New Halem up on Highway 20 as of Tuesday of this week. This is the company town, as it's called, owned and operated by City Light, and it's a situation where the Army Corps of Engineers has had to take over operations at Ross Dam. That's the one furthest upstream, which provides power to City Light. And I guess the idea is to make sure the dam is holding back whatever water it can, but really it sounds like the water flow from all the other parts of the Skagit River and other smaller tributaries there, the stuff that's unregulated, that's causing most of the flood problems, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, City Light, I mean, obviously their primary focus when thinking about the dam is generally power generation. But in an event like this where there's so much rain and flooding, that priority kind of switches away from power generation and toward flood management. And the Army Corps of Engineers just has more expertise in that. Not to say that City Light has none, but so this has happened, City Light told me 3 times in the past 5 years. So it's not totally out of the ordinary, but it's not like something that's happening all the time. So this is when the floodwaters are rising and the priority switches to making sure that there is not too much water filling Ross Lake while also not letting out so much that it makes the flooding worse.
Right.
You know, as you mentioned, the real problem with the Skagit River was not so much where the source was coming from. It's all of the runoff coming from all the streams and tributaries lower down. So even fully cutting off flow from Ross Lake, well, of course, that wouldn't be good for Ross Lake, probably wouldn't have prevented the flooding, but you can make it a little bit less bad. And that's where the Army Corps of Engineers steps in.
Which you got to try to do, because we're talking about some historic flooding levels out there. Did you get the idea that, I mean, are these dams healthy? Is this going to impact power production for City Light? What's the story there?
No, because, you know, they have enough resources. There's 3 dams on the Skagit River that are owned by Seattle City Light. There's Ross Lake, which is the highest up, and then there's Diablo and Gorge Dam. So Diablo and Gorge dams were still operating and still generating power, and then they have the Pend Oreille Dam in eastern Washington. So no, and you know, and frankly, it hasn't been that cold, and so you know, it's been rainy and windy, but it's not like we're at a time when people are in mass turning on their air conditioners or the heat or whatever might cause a power surge. So they said that they were able to do okay as far as keeping up with demand, and the focus really was just on preventing the flooding from getting any worse.
And looking for some landslide and other debris that might be getting in the way too. That's a huge part of this.
Yeah, that's a big part of the broader concern, and it's made a lot worse by all the wildfires, because when there's a wildfire, of course, you burn out all the vegetation, a lot of dead trees, and you create a lot more landslide risk. And then when we're thinking about the dams, if there are landslides, then there is a lot of debris that follows and things that might float on Ross Lake and toward the current. And, there's a big concern that you clog up the dam, basically, and make a barrier to the water flow. So, yeah, that was a big piece that they were monitoring. I didn't hear that it ever became a problem. It sounds like, I would say broadly with the flood management, obviously it's been a disaster, but I would say that the response has been pretty impressive from my mind, which is that we haven't heard of any deaths. We've heard of a lot of rescues.
Knock on wood.
Obviously people are going to be struggling with the damage to their homes and livelihoods for a long time, and that's tragic. I do think that the word got out, and it seems like people have heeded evacuation warnings, and so, the government response has been pretty all-encompassing. It's not to say it hasn't been a disaster, but, I guess I would just shout out all the people who are out there responding to this.
Oh, yeah. No, there's a lot of work going on. Thank you for that, David. I'm going to switch gears with you if I could. We are recording the show during a week when the Seattle City Council will vote on the consultant ethics ordinance brought up by outgoing council president Sarah Nelson. We talked about that last week. We'll keep you updated on what's going on there. They're also voting on approving the comprehensive plan, the roadmap for growth in the city over the next 20 years. David, there's one key issue I've heard about from council members I've talked to about this. It sounds like the council needs to agree on what it's going to do with these so-called neighborhood centers. So these are these designated areas around the city meant to be more walkable. They're supposed to be mixed-use Main Street of sorts with more housing, shop services near transit stops, but also still hopefully preserving neighborhood character. I can see our patron Steve looking right at us. It's a big, big issue for him, I know. Thank you, Steve, for bringing up this debate, as always. But I think the idea is how much height should people allow, or should the council, I should say, allow in these areas? Will it be 4 stories, 6 stories? Where do you see the council landing on this neighborhood centers discussion?
Yeah, they had a lot of this conversation earlier when they passed the first round of the comprehensive plan, and it's been going through some additional environmental review and legal review, and now it's to the full council again. And they're probably not going to make enormous changes, just because if they did, that might send it all back through a whole new round of environmental review, and that would prolongate what is already a very delayed process.
Yeah.
Technically, this comprehensive plan was supposed to be passed in 2024.
Right.
And so I imagine it will stick fairly similar to what it looked like over the summer when they passed this in the first round. They have this resolution attached to the broader comprehensive plan, which is, what are we going to look at next year and in future years? And that, because, back in, I can't remember exactly what month, but it was in the summer, Councilmember Alexis Mercedes Rink offered an amendment to add a lot more neighborhood centers. And it was rejected in part because some council members feared that by adding on all these additional neighborhood centers, you would prolongate the process a lot more and send it back through environmental review. But it did make it into this resolution, which is, hey, this is something we want to revisit, look at again next year. I think with Mayor-elect Katie Wilson's election, and she has said this on the record, that she's interested in looking at those again and maybe adding more. And so whatever they end up doing for sure today, I think in the future, I think this is going to be a city hall that is going to be more interested in adding more of these neighborhood centers, maybe expanding some that already exist. Plus, I think Mayor-elect Wilson is going to want to look at sort of density more broadly again, too.
Yeah, I think so, too. But I actually had a question come in from a patron, Robin, about this, what this new council, what a new mayor might bring to the comprehensive plan. Because as I understand it, the council is in this process now of looking to the Office of Planning and Community Development for more input and possibly some more amendments in 2026. As you say, I don't think they want to do too much here. That might scotch the whole process. They'd have to go through a whole other environmental review process with it. But with this new energy that we're seeing in City Hall, can you touch on that a little bit further? Where are you seeing the comp plan going, I guess, in 2026?
Well, I think you sort of get into technical details, whether or not it is these changes end up being specifically a piece of the comprehensive plan or sort of separate legislative efforts. We'll see. I think a lot of the focus of growth in Seattle and City Hall right now has been around, these urban villages, which are these areas that density has been allowed for a long time, and then near transit and transit-oriented development.
Right.
I talked to Mayor-elect Wilson about this a couple weeks ago after she'd been elected.
Yeah.
What might you want to do around this? And she talked about moving away a little bit, actually, from the transit-oriented specific growth, which isn't to say she doesn't support growth near those areas.
We're talking about a person from the Transit Riders Union here, of course.
Which isn't to say no growth there, but to expand that growth a little further away, because I think one of the complaints that happens from some kind of density advocates is when you focus all development in these sort of transit-oriented places, a lot of times what that means is you're building up development on Aurora Avenue or arterials that are not particularly walkable, are not particularly healthy to people. And so I think she has expressed interest and will probably look at, do we add more density kind of further inland, so to speak, away from these arterials into the kind of more neighborhoods. Of course, there's going to be density coming to all neighborhoods in Seattle, but I think she will want to open up a conversation around growing the boundaries around which you can add some level of maybe even low-rise development or mid-density kind of housing. And then, on the neighborhood center piece, it's interesting because this was really the policy proposal from Mayor Harrell that will leave its strongest mark on this whole comprehensive plan, which is these neighborhood centers. I mean, this was from his office. This is not a required thing for the city to do, unlike some of the other density changes.
Right.
And so it is sort of interesting. I don't know if it's ironic exactly, but it's funny that Mayor-elect Wilson is actually taking this idea and saying, hey, we should do more of this. So kind of a nod to Mayor Harrell's one of his sort of defining policy proposals when it comes to adding housing in Seattle are these neighborhood centers. And now you have the person who just defeated him saying, hey, that was a good idea. We should do more of that.
Yeah, I know he branded it with his One Seattle motto as the One Seattle Comprehensive Plan. So, again, a big vote on this for the City Council this week, but more conversation happening next year as well. All right, well, coming up, we know the City Council is headed toward a budget gap in 2027, but just how real are the plans to add progressive revenue, which so many candidates were talking about on the campaign trail? More details next on Now Hear This. Well, in the wake of approving an $8.9 billion budget just a few weeks ago, you wouldn't think we'd already be talking about a budget deficit, but that is indeed what's been forecast for 2027 for the city of Seattle. It's been a frustrating time for bringing in revenue, as I discussed recently with the council's budget chair, Dan Strauss, the council member from District 6. He pointed out the city had to use a 0.1% sales tax hike to help pay for public safety needs. He doesn't like that. But like all cities in Washington, Seattle can't raise property taxes beyond 1% each year. That's the state law, even if their costs due to inflation are rising beyond that. Here's how Councilmember Strauss put it.
All cities across the state are stuck right now.
Okay.
And for the legislature to not provide us relief in the ways that we were asking,
I see.
But to provide us this rate of the public safety sales tax, we had to take it, we had to use it, because we're out of options.
That is from a recent Council Edition program on Seattle Channel. Thanks, everybody, for watching out there. David, I really hadn't heard the idea put this way before. Do you see the city as out of options when it comes to bringing in new revenue? How do you look at that?
I don't think out of options, but they are shrinking. There was a proposal for a local capital gains tax.
Right.
Was that 24, I guess? That failed narrowly, just 5-4, even in this council, which is sort of generally seen as more moderate. So I fully expect and assume that will come back in 2026, probably. I know that Mayor-elect Wilson would support it, and I think that a lot, Dion Foster and Eddie Lynn and Alexis Mercedes-Rink and some others would probably get behind that. There's question about how much money that would actually bring in. I don't know. And, how many people this would actually target. There's some questions around whether or not that's a solution to the problem. And then they could also tweak some of the revenue sources that they have already. Maybe you dial up jumpstart tax and the payroll tax a little bit to bring in more money. This piece around the 1% property tax growth. That's real. I think that's more of an issue for counties, which really depend on those adjustments. It's in the sort of cap, which is 1%, which is less than inflation, and so it is a problem. You can go to Eastern Washington and talk to Republican county commissioners, and they will tell you that they're frustrated by this 1% property tax.
It's interesting because it was actually the Association of Washington Cities, which I would not say is a far-left group at all. I mean, that's moderate to right-leaning there, and they were asking for this kind of relief in terms of property tax in this past session. Again, as Dan Strauss pointed out, they didn't get that, but I think there is that push, certainly from counties and from some of these cities too, in other areas where they're trying to figure out the math. It doesn't work for them because we don't have an income tax. Not that I'm advocating for it, but this limit on the property tax is very real.
The whole theory behind the 1% tax is basically you stop the growth of the tax, and then if you want to raise it, you can go back to voters and ask them to raise it. And if they say yes, then great, you can do it. And at least that's the kind of theory that Tim Eyman, who ran the original initiative, put out there. And
don't say his name more than once or he'll like to show up.
Exactly.
I always say.
Well, in Seattle, the political reality is people do pass these property tax levy lifts, and they have repeatedly, as we've talked about a bunch. And so, the 1% cap doesn't, I don't think, affect Seattle quite as much, though it does raise questions about whether or not the property tax levies that we're running, particularly the transportation one, are actually doing what they're sold to do, which is additive projects rather than just sort of fulfilling basic city functions.
Because that's what the city of Seattle's doing right now.
Yes.
Like, take the Department of Education and Early Learning. So much of the work that's going on there, I think a lot of that's been pushed into the Families Education Preschool and Promise levy this year, for sure.
Which is sort of the risk of the whole thing, because now you've set up the city where if the next property or if the next transportation levy doesn't pass, 30% of SDOT's budget
that's
goes
an
away.
even better example.
And that I don't think is exactly how anybody imagined it, but it is the way that the city has gotten around this 1% property tax for years now, and I think there's going to have to be some hard questions about that in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah.
But then, I think to Councilmember Strauss's point around the state, what the state does, that I think that is going to be a push. Councilmember Lynn, in his very first meeting on council, pushed to amend the legislative agenda from the city, which is basically what the city lobbies state legislators to do, to include more progressive revenue options.
Yeah.
So this budget is, as we've talked about a lot, continues to be fundamentally out of whack, which is there are more programs than the city has money to fund.
Yeah.
But this is a council and a city hall that for the last 5, 6, 7 years has just been really hesitant to cut any of those programs, particularly the ones that were stood up around COVID and built on these one-time operating funds. They have now been sort of folded into the permanent budget without clear funding sources.
Yeah.
Add on top of that inflation and the rising cost of labor and goods and all these other things, then you get in this position where you can patch a budget as this year's is, and it doesn't do anything really for the next year's.
Yeah.
Another hole has opened up. So Mayor-elect Wilson, that is going to be one of the first things she's going to have to deal with, is patching a $140 million hole.
Yeah, and a related story here regarding funding for homeless services and some complications served up by the Trump administration here. We talked about this on the podcast a few weeks ago. The feds don't like the housing first model employed here in King County and Seattle when it comes to permanent supportive housing. Advocates say it's a proven model. You house someone first, then provide needed services. There's a much better success rate in helping people get back on their feet. But the Trump administration wants more money put into a treatment first type of model, also establishing work requirements for those who receive housing. David, I was reading your colleague Greg Kim has written about this. Local providers have this kind of three-pronged approach to try to deal with this potential major cut in funding for homelessness. And we're talking like $25, could be $40 million or more. Fighting the changes in court, that's one thing they'll try to do, find a way to backfill federal funding with local dollars, or trying to maybe adapt some of the local programs to match what the president is looking for. Do you have an idea what might be the most successful, or maybe you need all three? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I'm sure they will try to challenge it in court, because that would be the kind of most convenient in a lot of ways, that they could just keep doing what they're doing. As far as backfilling goes, we just finished up a conversation about how out of whack budgets are. So that has already been a bit of focus. Councilmember Rink had a basically $12 million add to this last year's budget, or it'll be next year's budget.
Yes.
To backfill some of the funding that could be lost as a result of this. So we're already seeing some minor moves, but it's not going to cover the entire cost. So then the question becomes, can these providers kind of find a workaround? Because, the fundamental thing here is that the Trump administration wants more mandates around what it takes to get into housing. Mandate that they go into treatment, mandate that they get a certain number of hours of work. Things like that. And I guess the question is, how much of a mandate is that? Is it enough to offer those services and them to be voluntary as long as they exist and are there? Because if that's the question, as we've talked about before, I don't know that there's any provider in Seattle who thinks that it wouldn't be a good thing to have more services available in permanent supportive housing.
Right.
And I do think that's a genuine problem, which that there is a lot of permanent supportive housing in Washington and King County that perhaps does not does not have the level of treatment or services that some people expect that they might. So in that sense, if they're able to kind of fulfill the wishes by saying, hey, look, we're putting more time and energy and money into scaling up these services, that's great. If it does become, in order to get into housing, you have to do these things, that is a much more difficult riddle for the housing providers to solve. And, as we've mentioned before, it's a rock and a hard place for these providers, because the contracts they have signed are built around housing first.
So that's what they're supposed to be doing.
So if they abandon the housing first model to please the federal government, they are sort of also they're suddenly fundamentally out of whack with their agreement with the county. And so it's kind of a lose-lose situation for them. I am not smart enough to know how they get out of it.
I was going to say, just to put a finer point on it, I don't think you think or I think that local governments, and I'm talking about Seattle and King County, they've set aside some money, both governments did, to try to, make sure they're prepared for the fact that there are going to be some federal funding cuts here, especially when it comes to homelessness. But I don't think they set aside nearly enough to make up that difference. Is that your take on it too?
Yeah, that is my understanding. And so the fear is you have people being turned out of housing and ending up on the streets. I have seen counter arguments to that said, no, it doesn't need to be that way, that you can adapt your models to fit these new mandates. But this is any sort of publicly funded service, particularly around homelessness, is a cruise ship, not a speedboat. So if the decision is to change how they do business, that's going to take a while. I don't know if it'll happen quickly enough to please the federal government.
Fair enough. All right, well, coming up, we're going to wrap up our final show of the season here with a look back at the biggest news of 2025. That's right around the corner on this special Patrons Appreciation episode. Stick around for What's Next. Once again, thank you to all the patrons who support the show. Big thanks to Steve and to Claire and to Omari for helping out here at City Grind Espresso, where we're recording in front of a studio audience, I guess. That's what we'll call it here. Appreciate the continued help there. And our background noise sponsor, appreciate them too. David, I want to put a wrap on 2025 here. Is there one headline or news event that stands out to you as the biggest event of the year?
I'll go with this sort of political angle, which is the year of taxing the rich, I suppose, or taxing corporations. And I say that just because it seems like, there's a lot of other, of course, stories happening in Seattle. But as far as what was the kind of winning political message of this year, I think it was clearly that between... And the ripple.
It was a big deal for Katie Wilson.
Well,
right?
No, I was going to say, I mean, the reason I think it's the story of the year is because that sentiment, which is that voters are in favor of taxing corporations and rich people, which started with social housing, is what led to Katie Wilson not only running for mayor but winning.
Yeah.
And so for that reason, and it was the one place. I do think in a lot of ways, Mayor Harrell ran the sort of administration that he said he was going to run when he was elected in 2021. And if you talk to people, there's been progress in downtown and police hiring is up and crime is down and all that. But the one place where he seemed to have sort of fundamentally misread the electorate was around this question of how much do they want wealthier people and large corporations to pay for services.
Yeah.
He was kind of on the wrong side of that issue, and it turned out to be much more politically popular than perhaps he calculated, and that gave an opening for Katie Wilson to win. And so now, as a result of that, we're going to have a much different 4 years, next 4 years than we would have otherwise.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. And I've just noticed it's very difficult for groups like, let's say, the Metro Chamber of Commerce or Amazon, for that matter, to actually try to put across this message of this is not good for business, this is not good for the economy, which I've heard a number of different ways and a number of different times, but that message isn't sinking in, or people just aren't hearing it. I don't want to say it's invalid. I think there's something to it. I mean, some jobs have moved across to Bellevue, that's for sure, but what do you think about that message just not being able to penetrate?
No, and it's not just at a city level, it's at a state level too.
Yeah,
because
right.
There was a lot of new taxes that were passed in the 2025 session.
Yeah.
And there was an interesting kind of analysis by the Ed Board at the paper the Seattle Times Ed Board, which was looking at how basically elected officials in the state's most progressive districts, so Capitol Hill, and elected Democrats in some of the more kind of purple districts voted pretty much exactly the same way, particularly around taxes. And I thought that was interesting, which is you can call it what you want, you can call it groupthink or whatever, but I also think there's a calculation even in purple districts that this is not a losing issue. I can vote for taxing corporations that are making a lot more money, despite all of the concerns being raised by the chamber and other business groups. And I'm not going to pay for it electorally. We'll see in 2026 if they end up doing that. I suspect not, considering that that'll be the first time. I think it's going to be a very friendly election cycle for Democrats, so I would suspect they won't pay for it. But I think just the calculations among Democrats of all stripes is that voters will reward putting new taxes on corporations and rich people. However you feel about that, I just think it is kind of the defining feature of our both local and statewide politics right now.
I'm with you on that. And looking ahead, what do you see as that big story of 2026? Perhaps it's a continuation of what you're saying with Tax the Rich. Is there anything else on your mind when it comes to what that big headline is going to be, or something you're paying closest attention to?
I think it's what does Katie Wilson do first?
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of different directions she could go, and
She kept her public safety team.
she kept her public safety team, which I think is actually reflective of the fact that that's not where she wants to go first. She would rather just keep some continuity there so that she can turn to something else. Does she take a big swing around childcare? And then, there's going to be, I think we're about to see a lot of asks from other kind of major civic institutions in Seattle now that the waterfront has wrapped up and that's finished. I think there's going to be a push from other kind of big players in the city for money and attention. And if she gives, how much of her attention will they get? And is she going to prioritize things like, big investments in prominent public places around Seattle rather than focusing that time and energy money purely on homelessness?
Yeah. She did make that big promise of 4,000 units of emergency housing, so that could be one path.
And so, what does that do to the oxygen in the room, I think, for the many, many other people and institutions in the city that want money and want her focus? And so I guess, to kind of distill it into one point is how does Katie Wilson triage, I think is going to be really fascinating this next year.
Because she's drinking from a fire hose in terms of information right now. And I have the sense that it is going to be something around this affordable housing piece, just because there were and social housing especially, those are the supporters of that measure there for funding for social housing. And again, going to richer corporations to try to make that happen. That was her constituency, or it seemed like a big part of it, don't you think?
Yeah, I think that was her base, and that's what got her elected. It is interesting. I think in her administration, she is not overwhelmingly going in that direction. I think Brian Surratt's presence in that administration is fascinating.
As her deputy mayor,
he kind of comes from the business world. He talks about the importance of the business community. He's done interviews where he talks about how important Amazon's presence is here.
Yeah.
He's kind of he is a dose of comfort to a lot of the people who I think supported Bruce Harrell, and I think a lot of people who did not support Katie Wilson are very happy to see Brian Surratt in that administration.
Okay.
So that, his presence there I think will be sort of fascinating. And so, yes, her base is that kind of tax the rich, tax the corporations, but so far she is governing in a way, I don't know if you want to call it a tack or whatever, but she's building her administration in a way that I think doesn't suggest she's gonna sort of come hell or high water pursue this agenda of taxing every rich person. She might, I don't know, but this is not a sort of closed door administration so far. I think a lot of people who maybe didn't expect to have her ear are finding themselves happily surprised that they might actually get a chance to talk to her and talk to her about her priorities. How that ends up in policy, I still don't know.
Yeah. Well, we do need to wrap up our show here, and David, I appreciate you joining me, and I do want to say that if there's a chance to revise our list of top stories for 2026, and that would mean the Mariners going to the World Series, would you accept that as the top story of the year?
Yeah, that would be great. I would put aside everything else.
Okay. Just checking on that one.
I have to find a way to get press credentials to the baseball. I have to come up with some kind of City Hall peripheral related story so I can get into the stadium.
We're gonna find a way, David. Come hell or high water. We got to make that happen for this year. Thank you so much for making this work. This is our 50th show of the year. Yikes, that's quite a load there, and our 300th overall, which is a big deal. Big thanks to the patrons who support the show and everybody listening out there. Thank you, David, for making this work. Looking forward to year 7 of the podcast. Thanks to everybody listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. If you like what you're hearing, please become a patron and support the show. Head to Patreon online. Find Seattle News, Views, and Brews. Pledge $5 per month or more, and thank you for the support. Big thanks to Steve and Claire and Omari, patrons who've shown up here. Big round of applause for them. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you doing that. Thanks to City Grind Espresso for hosting us once again, and thanks for listening to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you are listening. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media. See you next time.
Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2025.